This video is simple. It's just a bit of an interesting story that I wanted to share. Probably some of you know it already, it's about hacking and consoles, so let's do it. About the infamous PS Vita, I can sum it all up in 3 points. 1. Vita games are very decent. 2. Emulation on the Vita is great. You get PSP games, PS1, Game Boy, you name it. And even possibly Dreamcast. But third, and this is what this video is really about, is homebrew. Let's get the obvious thing out of the way first. Yes, the PS Vita could very well be a good purchase for you, yes, in 2020 of all years, depending on your interests, of course. And a simple YouTube search would prompt a wide gamut of gaming content creators explaining why. But I'm not here to persuade you to buy one, I'm just here to tell you the story of a console living way past its lifespan. Most likely, if you're watching this video, you're probably very aware of this console's history, but just in case, let's do a little less than a minute review. The original PSP launched in 2004. It was great, it had great games, it had a great influence, and people liked it, and it sold very well. Then, the follow-up, the Vita, launched in 2011, not so great. It had great hardware, but it was up to a slow start, and not a lot of the top developers were developing for it. So eventually it failed, Sony forgot about it and moved on to bigger things. The 3DS won this one. However, this tells you only one side of the story, and that's what most people focus on when they remember the Vita's already ended life cycle, at least from the outside of its community. Let's look back at another side of both the PSP's and the Vita's history, shall we? What a lot of people might not notice at first is that there's a whole mythology around the PSP. When the PSP released, a whole other community was birthed around it. That is, a hacking and homebrew community. Now, with the PSP, we saw the rise of groups of hackers, so much so that some of them even have Wikipedia pages. Some hacker group members like VITA, that were at the forefront of the movement, stated that this hacking was motivated by the desire, or rather the right, of having full ownership of the things you bought, an argument for open source hardware. Of course, this would eventually open the gates for piracy, and even viruses. But I think there's something more interesting here. As soon as the hacking began, Sony started a war, patching vulnerabilities, while other hackers figured out new ones to, keep on hacking. Peak attrition warfare. Either Sony would give up and stop releasing new updates, or hackers would just get tired and call it a day after a while. Of course, you know how the internet works. They didn't. People just started coming up with more and more creative ways of installing a modified version of the system that runs on the console. A custom firmware, if you will. And this wasn't always easy. Sometimes it meant just transferring a JPEG, smuggling a hidden naughty file into your device, but other times it was tough. A big name in the hacking community for the PSP was Dark Alex, a Spanish programmer who invented the Pandora battery method. A Pandora battery is basically a modded regular Sony battery. To make one, you just had to open up the PSP's battery, locate the S93C56 branded chip, desolder pin 5 and lift it, with the risk of pin 5 and 6 getting into contact, causing a short circuit which would be no good. And what this did was basically unplugging a part of the battery, which now would mean that the hardware would only receive ones instead of zeros from where it used to be. And what this did was basically removing a security feature of the device, making the PSP boot into service mode, therefore making it able to install a custom firmware. Very exciting indeed. Back in the PSP times, homebrew was a creative force too for other people. Having a PSP meant not only that you could play games with it, but now it was even possible to create content for it. And a lot of people did. There was a subsection of the community that decided to create what were called portals, a way of reskinning your device and maybe add a bit more functionality to it. Some links have survived the years and are still up for you to download, all playable from the Vita itself as well. Of course, the PSP hacker scene was fun, but the PSP didn't need it to survive, it had a very healthy life cycle. And that brings us to the topic at hand. The Vita supposedly died in 2019, as its production came to a halt, although many claim it did way earlier. Now, it depends on who you ask. If you ask a regular gamer, the Vita died at its early stages, as one of its most notable games, that isn't a launch title, is Persona 4 Golden, a remaster/remake that was released just a year after the console itself. And they're probably right. Even Sony didn't even seem to care further than that. At least in the West, the Vita had a slightly longer lifespan in Japan, which explains why most major games after Persona are more and more JRPGs. Shortly after though, the Vita became a breeding ground for indie games. It got a lot of hits: Shovel Knight, Hotline Miami, Limbo, Thomas Was Alone, Stardew Valley, Don't Starve, Fez, Crypt of the Necrodancer, Bastion, and the list goes on and on. Thus making a very colorful and diverse landscape of games on the platform. Even stranger is the fact that there are still games to be released in 2020. However, the Vita still has a very active community. Granted, not a very large one, but a very dedicated one, I'd say. Right as I'm writing this video, there are people just exploring the hardware, uncovering every nook and cranny hidden inside this little black box. People making their own apps, homebrew, developing emulators, porting games like Doom and Half-Life, even placing bounties on programming challenges. And in doing so, they've created a very active community, which is one of the things I, as I said in my previous video, like celebrating about gaming. The way we get together and kind of do stuff. A community of interest. Even when Sony forgot about the community it had created, the community itself rose up and said, no, this is ours now and we're gonna take over. So yes, the Vita is very much a zombie console. It's dead, yet alive somehow. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Thanks for watching. Please hit like, subscribe, share this video, and I hope I see you on the next one.